Robert, look, on the telly. Tonight's talk is a continuation of the last talk, talking about the church in the third millennium. And tonight I'm going to be talking emphasis on the second millennium, because we need to know history so that we can see basically the church is in the world and also outside of the world. It is not affected by history, although that is not the opinion here in the West. But the Orthodox opinion is not affected by history. We are affected by history because we're living in the world. And the more that we live in the church, the less we are affected. In the second millennium, there was a movement called Kollyades. And I want to talk about this because it's very important that we should know who they were and what they teach and how we too are Kollyades. The interesting thing is that the word Kollyades was disparaging. It's like saying the detestables. And it was a movement in the church which preserved tradition. And one of the traditions was to serve a memorial service on Saturday for the departed. That has been the thousands of years in the church. It began to, for some reason, well, I know why actually, because at St. Anne's Skeet, Johan and I went, they were building the new church. And so they didn't want to work, they wanted to carry on working on Saturdays to build the church. That's reasonable. So they moved the service to Sunday. But it's against the canons because we do not commemorate the departed publicly on the day of the resurrection. That has been the tradition of the church. Whether you believe it or not, accept it or not, is irrelevant. That's just the fact it is, okay? And today people do have memorial services on Sunday. So, but anyway, that's the foundation of it. The other part of the movement was that they recommended frequent communion. And in the earlier church, in earlier centuries, people went to communion all the time. This is what they did. And then for some reason it began to be irregular. I'm suggesting, but I don't know, that it's probably under the Turkish yoke where it was difficult to get to church anyway. The church was enslaved by the Ottoman Empire. But that's just my guess. I don't know for sure. The figures behind the Kollyades movement, and of course they call them Kollyades, which means Kolliva eaters, which at the memorial service we offer, what is it? Wheat, which is called Kolliva, and I bless it, at Pascha. So the term is these are Kolliva eaters. In other words, they're into tradition and they're out of date. And this same sort of disparaging remarks are made against anybody today who is traditional. And so this is, so it's very relevant to us today to know about Kollyades. I certainly follow that. The important figures in it, and then you'll get to know the importance of it, is the first one is Saint Macarius of Corinth. He was born in 1731 and reposed in 1805. And he wrote catechisms and apologetics for the people, because don't forget, Corinth at that time was under the Turks. And so he wrote a lot of things for them to explain the tradition of the church. The other person was Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain. They met at one time, and Saint Macarius had a collection of the early fathers' manuscripts, and he talked to Saint Nicodemus, and they got together, and Nicodemus went through all the libraries on the Holy Mountain, finding what they could about the fathers, which is amazing because the fathers that they found had not been referred to for 300 years. People knew who they were, but they didn't know what they wrote. And so Macarius and Nicodemus got together and put together the manuscripts and published as a book. We call that book today the Philokalia. So that's the origin of it. And the Philokalia is it's our catechism, and it's very much irrelevant for today. And I'll give you an example. For example, people suffer from anxiety. It becomes a disorder, anxiety disorder. But if you read Abba Dorotheus in the Philokalia, it talks about humility. If you have humility, then these things cannot disturb you. Also, total trust in God. This is in the Philokalia. So instead of going to a psychology manual to find out, oh, and how do I deal with this, you should go to the Philokalia and you'll find the answer. And in fact, it's very relevant for today's epidemic that we have of anxiety and depression. Apparently, the statistics is that 1 in 10 Americans has, in America and England it's the same actually, has depression. But if you read the Fathers on depression, this is a part of the spiritual struggle. It's not a psychological condition. It is the result of fallen nature, which we all have. And I don't know anybody that doesn't get depressed. Unless you're a saint, because it's a part of the struggle, the spiritual struggle. I'm not saying there aren't conditions where people can be, chronic state, but that could be for many reasons. The Philokalia, it was published as the Philokalia of the Holy Neptic Fathers. Do you understand the word neptic? It means watchful. So they're watching over their soul in their prayer, and it's called nepsis, being beditana in Russian.
And in Greek it's...
In nepsis. Yeah, nepsis. So neptic fathers. So these are the fathers that understood the spiritual life and had, this experience of the revelation of God. Later on, the Philokalia was translated into Slavonic. This was in Moldavia, in Neamt Monastery, and the monks were by Saint Paisius Velichkovsky. So he was also on the Holy Mountain. They hadn't met up yet, but when they started doing the translation, he met Nicodemus and Macarius, and so they worked together on a Slavonic translation. So the monks at Neamt in Moldavia, they worked on the translation. Then they sent the translation to St. Petersburg, to the Theological Institute, where it was fine-tuned, if you like, edited, proofread, published. In those days they published in Venice. So if you get an early copy of the Philokalia, which is rare of course now, it's a classic, it's printed in Venice, 1750. I saw a copy of that in Townshend Nights. Father Sophrony had a copy, an original. Well, that's the sort of history. Okay, what is this Philokalia? It is the traditional way of Christian spirituality, and I emphasize the word traditionally. This had begun to be lost. In Greece it was lost because of the Ottoman suppression. And it wasn't until St. Macarius and Nicodemus and Paisius Velichkovsky produced the Philokalia that the rest of the monks began to understand that there was a spiritual life and that there were writings which were very pertinent. Writings by St. Gregory Palamas. They knew who he was, but they didn't have the writings. St. Simeon, a new theologian. We can read these, we can get them from the library, but in those days they didn't exist. And so they put all this together. It was extracts from them. And as Greek theologians said, that it's not a... Now let me just find the quote here. The Philokalia, this quote, is not a collection of specialized mystical texts. It demonstrates what we seek when we participate in the life of the church. Human beings seek the love of the good and long for beauty. So the Philokalia is our catechism. We need it because it helps us to live the life. We are searching for love, we're searching for beauty. This is a part of our spiritual growth. This is how we grow. And so this book is not some mystical text that some monks can read, or you know, somebody in a cave or something. No, this is Christian way of life. So everybody should be reading the Philokalia. Now, some parts of the Philokalia are not easy to read and not suitable. We should never do it without direction or comparison. Now, when I say direction, sometimes we can't necessarily find somebody who can teach us, who has the experience, but you can share it among yourselves. We help each other. But the Philokalia isn't some special book that only, you know, priests or monks read. It's everybody should be reading, because you can read Psychology Today, you know, online, and you know, is it going to give you advice which is totally contrary to our Christian way of life, which we need to preserve, of course. Now, at the time, the Kollyades movement, don't forget, this is under Ottomans, so we're very restricted what you can do. At the same time, Europe was going through the Enlightenment, a great fervour, modernism, new things. I've got here a list here. Europe was being transformed. You had the French Revolution, Declaration of Independence here. Radical ideas, the encyclopedists. Do you know about encyclopedists? They wrote encyclopedia, French, and it was an encyclopedia of philosophy. So these are very exciting times for, you know, for intellectuals. We have people like Voltaire. I'm sure you may know that name. Fichte, you might not know. He rejected any idea of metaphysics or revelation. What you see is what exists. Very, very logical. And that, of course, that fitted in very well with the Enlightenment, in which was the age of reason. It was a fight against Christianity, and in my opinion, very justified, because Christianity was oppressive. Fire and brimstone. Calvinism, which was a very great emphasis on moral behavior. Now, of course, all these things are good in themselves, but they're not. But when it becomes a replacement for Christ and love of God, then there's something wrong. So this is what was happening in the West, in the Enlightenment. And of course, there was nihilism. Nihilism means doesn't believe that you can understand existence. Would that would
Annihilation.
Annihilation, yeah, yeah. And the Greeks under Ottomans were excited by this fervour in Europe, as though they couldn't join in, but they wanted to. Well, the intellectuals, so those that escaped, which happened, of course, moved to Europe, and also brought. And these were intellectuals who brought their Greek philosophy, which was not Christian, to add to the database of modernism. So the Kollyades dissented from this. They said, no, this is not correct. Do not, you know, talking to the Greeks, don't be influenced by the West. This is not a good idea. And they said, we're against modernism, and they proposed to, and I've got a quote here, to reawaken humanity to its essential original state, illuminated by the Church Fathers. What's the original state? The state before the fall. And this is what we should be looking at, not on this new idea in philosophy and, you know, the great innovation in art. I mean, I'm not saying everything in the Enlightenment was bad. There was advances in science, especially in medical science, which we benefit from today. This was God's gift. It wasn't totally, you know, alien to how we think. There were, I don't know about the exactly things, but there was new ideas in art, revolutionary ideas in art. But with the Kollyades, they said, no, we need to concentrate. What's important is for man to have a spiritual life, which is before the fall. This is what's important, not this rational scholarship and philosophy. Now you can see today, this is also pertinent today, that we should, as Orthodox, to keep our faith, and especially younger people, is if they want to keep their faith, they need to turn to the Philokalia to find out what to do, basically, and not turn to psychology and philosophy and whatever else there is out there, which is the opposite. Now, this is not a condemnation of the West, but there's some pretty problematic things here with rationalism. Yeah, yeah, I know, logic. Well, you know, of course we have logic. Everybody does. Also, the Kollyades actually very important thing. They produced biographies of new martyrs, because this was sustaining the faith of the Greeks in slavery. There you are, martyrs around you, new martyrs. And where we have martyrs, we all have a growth in faith. I mean, every day you read in the prologue or in the calendar, there's a martyrdom. Every day there's a martyr or martyrs, and this is a part of our witness. I mentioned that last week actually, about the word martyr means a witness. It's not just somebody who was killed for their faith, but anybody. We can be martyrs in the sense that I think we will be martyrs. I don't necessarily mean physically, but I mean that we're going to be martyrs because we'll be ostracized by not being very nice people, because we don't love everybody, which is not true. We don't like everybody, that's a different thing. And we don't agree with certain, you know, things in society around us. I said here, I made a note, the new secular order was against oppressive religion, fire and brimstone theology, moralistic Calvinism. On the contrary, Kollyades presented the Philokalia as a witness to the genuine experience of the church. Emphasis on experience, a palpable connection to God through divine revelation. Our faith is revealed. It doesn't come to us through logic. That teaching of the Western Church is logic, that you can work out who, you know, God, you can prove God logically, which is, I don't know how, but for us it is revelation based on the experience. We have modern martyrs today. We have the Romanian martyrs, and this millennium, in the third millennium, we have two particularly, George Calcu and Father Arsenia Papachok. If you read their lives, it's amazing how they survived the torture for years, not just you know, one-off, but regular, and that they have an experience of yeah, they are saints, I would say. Saint George experienced divine light in his cell, the whole place lit up with the divine light, uncreated light. This is experience of God. You do not experience God by sitting down and thinking about it logically. You're allowed to use your logic because it's a gift from God. Our intellect is a gift, but we must understand that it is also subject to fallen nature. So the experience of God is something divine. It cannot be achieved even by ascetic efforts. You can't say, well, if I practice asceticism, I will become enlightened. Yes, you will if you're a Buddhist or a Hindu, but you're certainly not as Christian. It's a gift from God. It's from Christ. The Kollyades rescued from oblivion the Church's witness to the most essential issues of the Christian faith. This refers back to the Fathers, St. Simeon the New Theologian in particular. He wasn't popular when he was alive. In fact, he was actually exiled because of his spiritual experiences. In fact, banished to a small monastery on the Bosphorus. Later on, they wanted to restore him back to Constantinople, but he said, no, I'm staying where I am, and he stayed until he died. Well, we have his writings. This is a gift that we have, and you can go and read him. Very important to read his life, written by his disciple, because it tells you about when he was a young man, not a monk, a young man, had experience of the divine light, uncreated light. So it's, I think it's encouraging if you read it. So in the West you have a revolution, which is a logical, rational revolution. In the East you have a spiritual revolution. And the Philokalia publication challenged, and today challenges, the progressive view that man is merely a biological entity, an elaborate machine who can be conditioned to conform to society. And that is what society today is trying to do. The pressure, the social pressure, is that we actually are basically super apes. We're animals. No different from animals, except that we have intellect. This is a lie. It's not true. We're made in the image of God, and we cannot be animals. We're not animals. Of course, we have bodily functions. Of course, we have biological. We're made made like other animals, but this is we are spiritual beings. We are made in the image of God, and the world out there says no. If something's wrong, it's because of your genes or something else. Anything that's non-spiritual. And this is a deception that is very popular, and it's very hard, especially if you're studying or a student, to resist it. My advice to you is don't get involved in discussions. Believe what you believe, and you must know in the Soviet Union, there were Christians in all sorts of areas. If they found out they were Christians, they were dismissed. You weren't allowed to teach mathematics in the Soviet Union if you were a Christian, because you might influence the students. Don't ask me how. Well, I know how, because you are Orthodox and you affect people. Yeah. People who are involved in demons and black magic and things like that, they feel the presence of us in the shop, store, or in a room. They feel it. Yeah, and so that is that we have to be aware of. So we want to make people into useful members of society. This is the aim of the world. But truth is more than usefulness. I'd like you to think about that. The Philokalia is an antidote to European nihilism, Western rationalism, and individualism. We are persons, not individual. In fact, in Greek philosophy, the word for an individual, this is actually idiotis. Idiot. Idiot. Individual is an idiot. We are persons because we live in Christ. We're part of community. And we are a community as a church, of course, and as a parish. And tonight, gathering tonight, is part of community. We're not individuals, we are persons because we belong to community. We possess the traditional way of Christian spirituality practiced through centuries. We possess authentic, original Christian tradition in the third millennium.